email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Today's guest is an individual who definitely understands how to perform under pressure. He's a retired Navy SEAL officer with over 20 years of service, during which he completed 13 overseas deployments, including 11 to Iraq and Afghanistan, and led the rigorous training and selection process for an elite SEAL command, identifying the attributes that drive peak performance. He has taken his extensive knowledge of leadership, performance, and resilience and applied it to the business world. He speaks globally and works with top companies such as Google and the San Francisco 49ers. As an Atlanta Falcons fan, I might have a problem with that, but, inspiring audiences to harness their potential and thrive in every aspect of life. Rich Diviney is also the best-selling author of The Attributes, 25 Hidden Drivers of Optimal Performance, a game-changing book that helps people and teams understand not just what they do, but who they are. The book paved the way for the launch of The Attributes Incorporated, a speaking and consulting business that has transformed how companies hire, build teams, and develop leaders by prioritizing innate attributes over learned skills. Rich, welcome to the conversation. It's so nice to talk to another Navy guy.
Well, thank you, Clint. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I like to think of all my guests who come on as superheroes, and boy, you certainly qualify. So all superheroes have an origin story. So what's yours?
Yeah, well, it's very normal, and we'll get into that. I think everybody has the potential to be a superhero, but my origin story is I grew up in Connecticut. Grew up always, ever since early days, wanted to be a Navy pilot. My twin brother and I both wanted to be Navy pilots because we wanted to fly jets. And then what's harder than having to land jets on ships? There's nothing cooler than that. So that was the impetus to my interest in the Navy. However, it was the early 90s, so 91-ish, I learned about Navy SEALs. And I was like, oh, who are these guys? They seem pretty cool. And then that kind of put a bug in my brain. My brother and I ended up going to Purdue University. I was in the RTC program, and by the time I was getting ready to graduate, really said to myself, all right, well, I know I can be a pilot, but I don't want to always wonder if I could be a SEAL. And so that's why I tried out. I applied, got it, got in, and then went to SEAL training, and luckily made it through. I guess, well, not luckily, but I guess I made it through. And then subsequently started a 21-year career in the teams. Obviously, the first 5 years were fairly quiet, but once 9/11 hit, things got pretty kinetic, and so ended up doing over 13 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, and then other places. I was an officer, so I commanded obviously SEAL troops, SEAL platoons. I was a commanding officer for a SEAL squadron, and even ran training and assessment and selection for development group, which is kind of known as SEAL Team 6, which really was one of the places where I began to discover this attribute stuff. As I discovered that, I know we're going to get into that, but I got out of the Navy in 2017, was in the leadership space, recognized that I really wanted to talk about performance and really kind of rehash this attributes work, and ended up writing the book and getting it out. And I think 2021 it came out. So subsequently have been, running this business with my wife. We have two awesome boys. They're actually not boys anymore; they're young men. But we've been able to go around the world and the nation, just helping people understand their attributes, and in doing so, their performance individually and as teams. And so that's really what's been the real fun of this. So that's the Reader's Digest version, I guess.
Well, I went to Norfolk recently for a reunion of some of the people I was on board with, and I will say that the Norfolk that's there now is not the Norfolk that I was there in the early 80s. Yeah. There are no more signs that say sailors and dogs keep off the grass.
Right, so they're a little bit more accepting of the military now. It's a really huge military town. Obviously, Norfolk, Virginia Beach is the area. So, but we've been here, for 24 years now. So, yeah, we enjoy it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what are attributes, and how do you define them, and why are they more important than skills?
Yeah, attributes are, in fact, the qualities about a human being that, when it comes to performance, tell us that human being has what it takes to do the job versus knows how to do the job. And ultimately, kind of to break down the definition, skills are not inherent to our nature. So in other words, none of us are born with the ability to ride a bike or throw a ball, or in the military case, shoot a gun. Skills also direct our behavior in known and specific environments. So here's how and when to ride a bike or throw a ball or shoot a gun. And then because skills are very visible, they're very easy to assess and measure and test. You can see how well anybody does any one of those things. You could put scores around skills. You could put statistics around skills. You can also put skills on resumes, which is why we often get seduced by looking at skills when we're hiring or selecting or even performance evaluating. They're the easy button. The problem with skills is they don't tell us how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty. And in an unknown environment, it's very difficult to apply a known skill. This is when we lean on attributes. And so attributes, on the other hand, are elemental. In other words, all of us are born with levels of patience, adaptability, resilience, situational awareness. Now, you can certainly develop attributes over time and experience. However, you can see levels of this stuff in very small children. And I would say anybody who has kids or even hung out with kids will agree with me when I say that there are 1.5-year-olds who are patient and there are 1.5-year-olds who are impatient. Okay, so there's a nature-nurture element to attributes. Attributes don't inform or don't direct our behavior. They inform our behavior. They tell us how we're going to show up to an environment. So my son's levels of perseverance and resilience, for example, informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're difficult to see, they're difficult to assess, measure, and test. You know, how do you measure someone's levels of patience or adaptability? But they show up the most visibly and viscerally during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty. And so the reason why they're important is because if we're not focused on attributes in our evaluation of performance, both in ourselves and others, as we are missing a huge part of the performance picture. In other words, who are we and how do we show up at our most raw? And do we have the qualities? This is the idea. So many organizations and businesses get in the trap of hiring people based on what they see on the resume. This person's perfect on paper, but then they get into the team or the culture and they end up being toxic. And it's because they judged the person on the wrong things. They judged them on the visible skills. So the one story I'll tell about this that really hammered it home when I started this work was I was talking to a Navy SEAL instructor. He had been a SEAL instructor well before I had gone through SEAL training. And he said, Rich, there's a story of a kid who showed up at SEAL training one day and he walked into the instructor's offices and said, I want to be a Navy SEAL. And the instructor said, well, okay, you have to do a swim test. The kid said, fine. And so they took him out to the pool. It was an easy test. It was 50 meters. So 25 meters to one end, 25 meters to the other end. Anyway, this kid gets all ready to go and he jumps into the pool and then proceeds to sink to the bottom of the pool. And at the bottom of the pool, he starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one end. He touches one end and he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. And he comes up, he's gasping for air, nearly drowning. And the instructor looks at him and says, what the heck are you doing? And the kid, who's still trying to catch his breath, looks at the instructor and says, I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim. And at that point, the instructor pauses and he looks at the kid and says, that's okay, we can teach you how to swim. And the idea is, why did the instructor say that? He said that because he knew if this kid had the qualities, the attributes to show up to Navy SEAL training without knowing how to swim, he had everything inside of him we needed for him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be the easy part. And so what we have to understand as teams, as businesses, as organizations, is we have to understand these attributes. We have to dive into them if we want to find the people who, in fact, are going to be the culture fit, the quality fit that we're looking for.
There's a story early in the book that really hooked me because I do a lot of teaming, and you talk about Julie, whose first big project didn't go very well, despite having, like you just said, her dream team on paper. The resumes were amazing. So what happened there?
Yeah, so Julie fell into the same trap we often all fall into, and I call it the dream team paradox. And it's this idea that let's pick the best people for a team, the best graphics designer, best marketer, best salesperson, best legal person, whatever that is. And if we have the best people, they'll make the best team. And that often happens when everything's going well. But as soon as something doesn't go well, as soon as what hits the fan, as soon as the plan takes a turn, often those teams turn toxic. And it's because we haven't picked the team based on these qualities, these attributes. And so we have to avoid this idea of picking a team based on the best parts. A great way to explain this, I was researching a guy years ago, and his name was Russell Lakoff. And Russell Lakoff had some interesting titles. He was a systems theorist, behavioral analyst, and management science expert. And he used to give lectures I used to watch on YouTube in the early days of YouTube. And his lectures were fascinating. But one of the things he used to say in his lectures, he used to ask the group, he said, if I took the best parts of every best vehicle on the planet and put them all together. So for example, let's say the Porsche has the best engine, a Ferrari has the best carburetor, a Jeep has the best suspension, whatever that is. Took the best parts of every best vehicle on the planet and put them all together in the center of the room. Would I have the best vehicle on the planet? And the answer is no. You wouldn't even have a vehicle because the parts wouldn't fit together. And what he used to say is a system is never the sum of its parts. It's a product of their interaction. And the same goes with a team. A team is never the sum of its parts. It's a product of how that team interacts. So if you try to put together a team based on skills, if they're not interacting together, you will have a toxic team. And that's why attributes are important.
Yeah, I love that. I was going to talk about it later, but you did a perfect job segueing there. So I love that quote about systems. And then this is my next question. But let's say you're not able to pick your team. I mean, a lot of us, when we get to an organization, you're given a team and say, hey, you're going to go do this. So if in Julie's case, she wasn't able to pick her team, or she did, but she picked based on resumes. So what if you're not able to pick your team and you can't change out team members? Now, what do we do?
Yeah, then it's more incumbent that you look at your team members from an attributes perspective, because what you'll find is everybody. So just to give everybody a sense of this, there's, in the book, I talk about 25 attributes. Now we've upgraded that list to 41 attributes. The idea is every single human being has every single attribute. We all have all of them. But the difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each attribute. So if we take adaptability, for example, and on our assessment tool, we have the Likert scale 1 to 7. 7's high, 1 is low. I'm about a level 6 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it, okay? Someone else might be a level 3 on adaptability. When the same thing happens to them, it's difficult for them to go with the flow, right? They're still adaptable because all human beings are, but there's more friction there. There's more, there's more challenge there. And so if we're kind of line up these attributes on a wall like dimmer switches, all of us would have different dimmer switch settings. And that starts to speak to our own unique individual performance. I also like to think of it as like we humans are all automobiles. Okay, we're all basically the same in the sense that we're automobiles. However, some of us are Jeeps, some of us are Ferraris, and some of us are SUVs. And there's no judgment there because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. But it behooves us to lift our hood and figure out what kind of car we are, because that might be the source of the friction. We might be a Jeep that's been trying to run on a Ferrari track. But all this to say is when you have a team, even if you haven't picked that team, understanding every individual's unique set of attributes allows you to actually assemble and start working with that team in a way that complements people's specific attribute set. So in other words, if one person on the team is low on adaptability and another person's high, well, when the environment requires some adaptability, that person who's high on adaptability can step up and take charge or take lead, or help and guide. Same thing with you pick the attribute, innovation or creativity or just discipline, whatever that is. And so teaming, whether you get to pick your team or whether you have a team you're just starting with, understanding your team at these very elemental levels will allow you to take the team from a regular performance to very high performance.
And it sounds like you have an assessment people can take to figure out where they are on that scale.
We do. So when we've developed over the last 4 years, this 41 attribute assessment where you take it and you figure out, it shows you how you rank your attributes. So your top one all the way to your 41st. However, I will say when you take that, it'll allow you to kind of focus specifically on it'll give you a ranking of all 41, but it'll encourage you to focus on your top 5 and your bottom 5. But that top 5 and bottom 5 does not equal strengths and weaknesses. In other words, you are successful as a human being as much because of your bottom 5 as you are your top 5. I always say that just because you're low on an attribute doesn't mean you have to develop that attribute. In fact, developing that attribute might be detrimental to your specific niche. The stand-up comic who has too much empathy is going to be a lousy stand-up comic, right? So it's really about understanding your unique performance fingerprint and allowing yourself to say, okay, this is actually how I show up. Now, top 5 and bottom 5 also come with blind spots. In other words, you will have blind spots because you have this particular top 5 and because you have this particular bottom 5. So the proper introspection there is to understand what those blind spots might be as well. But the cool thing about attributes is there's no judgment there. All you are doing is figuring out what kind of vehicle you are.
Now, you said you've gone from 25 to 41. Do you still have the 5 basic categories: grit, mental acuity, drive, leadership, and team ability?
We have those 5, but also 4 more. So we actually have 9 categories now. We've moved a couple. Again, the categories are really more of a way to comfortably bin these attributes, and they kind of bin in these categories, but it's not a black and white thing. In other words, while courage is a grit attribute, one could make an argument about courage being a leadership attribute as well. But it helps kind of categorize them in a more meaningful way. But yeah, now we have 9 categories. Yeah.
I like when you talked about leadership. This wasn't a question; it was just something that popped into my head. It's kind of like, to me, it's you can't give yourself your own nickname, and you can't call yourself a leader. Other people have to decide whether you're a leader or not.
That's right. You can't self-designate. That's like calling yourself good-looking or funny. Other people decide whether or not you're a good leader based on the way you behave. I always say, if you call yourself a leader and you look back and you got no one following you, I got bad news for you. You're not a leader. But being in charge, people think that just because they're in charge, they are a leader, and that's not the case. Being in charge is different. That's a position. And you can assign positions, and anybody can, and you can self-designate. People can say, I'm in charge, right? But whether or not people choose to follow you is their decision, not yours. And that's going to be based on how you behave.
Now, of the 41 attributes, are there any that you think are more critical than others when it comes to being leading under pressure?
So the answer is, the holistic answer to that is no, because pressure, challenge, and uncertainty, that by definition you don't know what you require in those environments. So any one of the attributes could bubble up as being important. However, I don't gaff off the question, and I will say that in the conduct of life, I think the grit attributes present themselves as very important to have, and those are courage, adaptability, resilience, and perseverance. And I say that because if you're low on those 4 things, you're going to have a rough go of it. so they become because life requires all 4 of those things, especially when things get tough. So I think those are important. Again, I wouldn't qualify them as the most important because it would depend on the situation, but those are definitely important.
I think grit's probably why I made it to Georgia Tech, to be honest, because I wasn't the smartest guy there.
Yeah. And again, grit, like I said, grit is a category. It's not an attribute. People often make the mistake of saying grit or referring to grit as its own singular thing, but grit is not a singular thing.
No, you listed them, yeah.
Yeah, it's a combination of stuff. So again, you can have in those 4 attributes, you can be a little bit higher on a couple of them and a little bit lower. You're still contributing to your own grit, but you can also start to see where you may have to put in a little bit more effort.
Now, I have this question from before. I knew that you have an assessment now, so maybe the assessment is the answer. But how can somebody assess whether their team has the right mix of attributes or a person has the right attributes for a specific role?
Yeah, so that's going to be a much more subjective task. Something we help businesses and teams do. But first, you have to figure out, okay, what does my specific team or organization, which attributes do we prioritize in terms of what it looks like to be a top performer on this team? So in other words, the attributes that make up the great Navy SEAL team, that list is going to look different than the attributes that make up a great surgical team or teaching team. So if project number 1 is to, as a team organization, decide what are the top attributes that are required for being part of this team. Now that list, by the way, those critical attributes, the ones that you absolutely have, it should be a very small list. And by very small, I mean 1 or 2 things, because you can't expect to find the unicorns, in this stuff, right? And even Navy SEALs, I would say that maybe the number 1 or probably the top 2 attributes for Navy SEALs are probably courage. No, excuse me, I wouldn't even say courage. I would say compartmentalization and probably perseverance, something like that. Maybe you could throw an adaptability there, but it has to be a small list. And so what are those top attributes? And then from there, and then you can do that per role as well, because the attribute list for a great CEO is going to look a little different than the attribute list for a great CIO or CFO or HRO, right? So what does it look like in those roles as well? So that diligence needs to be done so that you can then start effectively looking at the individuals, A, both in that role, or B, the ones that you're bringing into that role.
Is there an attribute that you think is overlooked more than it should be?
Wow, that's a great one. Again, I think it's contextual to the environment, because again, there are some roles that don't require as much creativity, but more discipline. There are some roles that don't require as much discipline, but need more, adaptability, whatever that is. And so I think what happens more often is that people, they either think that attributes are important where they're actually not as important as they think they are, or they don't pay attention to certain attributes that may in fact be important. Narcissism is a great example of this. This is one we always have fun with. And you know, because you've read the book, that narcissism, when we talk about it as an attribute, there's no judgment there. Okay. Most people, when they hear that word, they think narcissistic personality disorder, which is a codified disorder in the DSM-5. But when you look at the DSM-5, first of all, there's 9 criteria in that book that the physician will read through. And if the physician can answer yes to 5 or more of those criteria, the physician can then consider the patient disordered. Okay. But only about, I think, 3 or 4% of the population have the disorder itself. When I looked at the list, because I got a copy, I read through the 9, and I'm happy to say that I couldn't say yes to 5 or more. However, I wasn't innocent of everything I was reading. In other words, I read something, I was like, well, sometimes I feel this way, and sometimes I think this way. And so I kind of rewound a little bit, and I said, well, why did I become a Navy SEAL in the first place? Obviously I was a 20-year-old kid. There was no war going on. I mean, I wanted to serve my country and stuff, but there was nothing going on in terms of I got to get out there and serve. And when I was really honest with myself, I said to myself, well, one of the biggest reasons is because I wanted to see if I could be a badass. I wanted to see if I could do something very few people could do. And I asked my buddies the same thing, and they said the same thing. Yeah, I'm a patriot. Yeah, I want to serve my country, but I wanted to see if I could do something very few people could do. So then I rewound it, and I kind of said, okay, what is the very elemental definition of narcissism? And that is the desire to stand out, be adored, be recognized, be made feel special. And every psychologist on the planet will tell you that every human being on the planet at some point in their lives wants to stand out, be recognized, feel unique, feel special. It's a very elemental human desire. And so narcissism at its elemental level is something that we all have. And we all have that desire. It's also the impetus to some of our most audacious goals. Why else would you want to be a Navy SEAL, or the best podcaster, or the best author, or whatever that is, best surgeon? But we all have those elements. And so I think what we'll often get with exec teams, and they'll do the assessment and they'll come up low on narcissism. They'll be patting themselves on the back. And again, that's fine. It's great, because as a leader, you don't want to have to be the one who stands out and be recognized. However, I always ask the question, okay, what are some blind spots that you have to be aware of with everybody being low narcissism? And when they really think about it, it's like, you know what? We are sometimes the fly on the wall. We sometimes go into these board meetings, and all we talk about is the stuff we screwed up, or the stuff we could do better. We never talk about the stuff we've kicked butt in, or the stuff that we've really stand out, or why we're unique. And oh, by the way, worse than that, we don't do it for our team. We don't do it for the people in our span of care. We don't have them or encourage them to stand up and stand out and feel unique and feel special. And so this is one of those attributes that when looked at from a non-judgmental, from a neutral optic, one often finds themselves saying, you know what, I need to up my narcissism in certain cases, or understand, if you have a social media manager in your company, you want that person to be higher on the narcissist scale. You want them to be thinking, how can we make this place stand out and be unique? And so again, the cool thing about these attributes is if you remove judgment, it gives you a whole different viewpoint, and you can now start to access levels of performance that you never thought you could, or you may have in fact been biased against because you thought it was bad.
So every narcissist is happy now. See, it's a good thing.
What's interesting about the disordered, by the way, and I'll just add, okay, because people might be still raising their eyebrows, disordered or unhealthy narcissists, even not the disordered ones, unhealthy narcissists are very easy to spot. Okay, they are people who always surround themselves with sycophants, with people who bend the knee, with people who tell them what they want to hear. And by the way, those groups are transient. You can't be a sycophant forever. So eventually someone will leave that group. As soon as that person leaves that group, that person becomes enemy number one to that narcissist. Okay, that is an example of unhealthy narcissism. However, I have a buddy of mine who he took the assessment, and this guy, when he took the assessment, he calls me and he says, "Hey, I think I have a problem." I was like, "Why?" And he said, "Because narcissism came up as my number one. It's number one attribute." And so I pulled up his results. He said, "Is that bad?" I was like, "Well, no, it's not bad, because your number 2 is compassion. Your number 3 is empathy. Your number 4 is charisma." This is a guy who he wrote his own book. He gets on stage and he speaks. He loves being on stage. He loves being the center of attention. He's also the most humble, kind, compassionate, empathetic guy you'll ever meet, right? So he is an example of high narcissism, but a very healthy version of it. Okay, so again, the key is to take judgment out and start asking ourselves these very honest questions about our performance.
Okay, well, there's some other attributes I want to get into, but before I do, I wanted to ask, you talk about optimal performance in the book, and how is that different from peak performance, and why does it matter?
Yeah, it matters because there's always been, even when I was starting this work, there's always been a hyper focus on peak performance. You always hear about teams and organizations wanting to be peak here, peak there. Everything's about achieving peak performance. And people used to tell me, they used to say, you Navy SEALs, you're the ultimate peak performers. And I disagreed with that. I said, no, because peak by definition is an apex. There's only one place you can go from an apex, and that's down. The other thing about peak performance is peak often has to be planned for and scheduled and prepared for. The pro football player plans and schedules his entire week so that he can peak for 3 hours on game day, right? We don't get to do that. Navy SEALs don't get to do that. None of us normal people get to do that. So what I said is we are, in fact, optimal performers. We are, and when optimal performance means I'm going to do the very best that I can in the moment, whatever the best looks like in the moment, okay? So sometimes our best in the moment looks like peak. And it's flow states and everything's clicking and everything's off groovy and cool. Sometimes our best in the moment, though, is I am just head down, gutting it out, grinding, going step by step because that's all I have right now. And it's gritty and it's dirty and it's ugly and it's hard. Okay, that is still performing optimally. And so what we have to understand is teams have to focus on optimal performance versus peak because it allows us a couple really important things. First of all, it allows us to celebrate those times when we are not at peak. Because, I can't tell you how many missions we went on in Iraq or Afghanistan. We come back and we're like, man, that was ugly. But we still got the job done, okay? The other thing, and more importantly, it allows us what I call responsible energy management. In other words, I don't need to be peak when I'm driving to the grocery store, okay? I can be at some other energy level. You may be surprised, people may be surprised to find, because they watch TV and movies, they see on TV and movies a bunch of SEALs getting ready to go on a mission, and right before they go, they're all hoo-yawing and high-fiving and all hyped up, right? That never happens, never. In fact, most of the time we'd be in our helicopters flying into combat, and the guys around me would be napping, they'd be sleeping. And there's a reason, because we don't know what's coming. We don't know what's going to be required of us energetically. We're not going to waste an ounce of our energy doing things we don't need to do. So optimal performance allows us to think of performance as this umbrella underneath which peak lives and gutting it out lives and even recovery lives. But we're always modulating ourselves because you can't be peak all the time. And so the idea is not to chase peak performance, it's to chase optimal performance.
Well, that concludes part one of my conversation with Rich Diviney, retired Navy SEAL commander, inspirational speaker, and best-selling author of The Attributes. Coming up in part two, Rich explains the benefits of understanding and utilizing fear as a tool.
Fear is a risk assessment tool. It's nature's risk assessment tool, and those who don't understand it and utilize it for that purpose will find themselves running into stuff that they shouldn't be running into. So fear allows us to think better, be more, not get complacent, to pay attention. It focuses us. It gives us adrenaline. There's a lot of things that fear does for us that really get us in the zone for top performance.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.